Hello, and welcome to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to take a look at oil company data predicting global warming. Should they be accountable for its effects? Now, these weekly ethical dilemmas in science are based on current events, and the idea is to understand the science involved as well as the potential ethical issues. So, in a January 2023 Guardian article, it reports that ExxonMobil scientists, as early as the 1970s and early 1980s, were generating data and then creating internal models that very accurately projected the warming trend that was kind of paralleling what was seen by independent academic scientists as well as government models. And at that time, as early again as 1977, Exxon scientists were warning their executives, according to this report, about potentially catastrophic anthropogenic, or basically human-caused global warming since 1977. And so these documents are part of a collection that were coming from the public archives provided by ExxonMobil, as well as resources from other fossil fuel companies as well. And the data basically indicate that they were aware of the scientific evidence that was supporting the idea of global warming, potentially as early as the 1960s. Now, the Guardian article, it's basically a newspaper account available on the web, but is reporting on an article published in the scientific journal Science in early 2023. And in that model, represented here with the cover of that article and a little bit of the data that were present within this, what we can see is basically the models that are projecting global warming based on the ExxonMobil data, the proprietary data from 1982. And what we're seeing in both the red line and the blue line is what was actually being observed. And so this red line right here is showing the change in temperature over this period of time, where this line in blue is the actual observed carbon dioxide concentrations with the environment. And again, the black lines are coming from the ExxonMobil data. And so it's important to recognize that in spite of their own scientists in the 1970s and 1980s very accurately predicting global warming, the executives and the companies and their advertising campaigns were attempting to downplay the risk of global warming, in many cases emphasizing the fact that the scientific data was incomplete, that there were a lot of uncertainties involved with trying to interpret this information. So in order to kind of think deeper about this dilemma, in essence, about these oil companies with their own scientific data going back close to 45 or 50 years, showing the evidence of global warming despite their efforts to kind of downplay that risk, we're going to look at two examples of other industries that have had risks associated with their products and the overall outcome on what has happened to them, on their impact on the public and society. Now, the first example of that is going to be the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry, in their advertisements in the 1950s, were providing scientific evidence showing that these, in this case, these cigarettes are not associated with adverse effects on the nose, throat, and sinuses. So scientific evidence that smoking doesn't hurt you. Going into the 70s, a big campaign about cigarettes and their kind of natural kind of refreshment. They're natural, kind of created from tobacco, created from a plant product, and that this was natural. There weren't chemicals added to it, even though in the processing, potential chemicals are going to be added in that in the development and the production of the cigarette. But basically promoting kind of limited risk and the benefits of cigarette smoking. In reality, even going back into the 1970s, there was evidence of harmful health effects associated with cigarette smoking. This is a scientific article published in 2021 showing the effects of cigarette smoking on healthcare spending in the year 2014, and an infographic that goes along with this. What they show is basically a disproportionate expenditure of healthcare funds on patients that have a history of cigarette smoking. And so cigarettes are accounting for, in 2014, 16.4% of healthcare inpatient spending, about 6% of non-inpatient care, and about 13.4% of prescription drugs, in many cases exacerbating existing conditions. So what happened with the tobacco industry in 1998, in response to a number of lawsuits brought forward by states and different municipalities, there was a master settlement agreement entered between tobacco companies and a number of states, D.C., District of Columbia, and territories, that resulted in a promise of a $250 billion, billion with a B, payout over a period of 25 years. And associated with that, the tobacco companies agreed not to market to youth, kind of eliminating the use of cigarette smoking in cartoons, as well as reducing advertisements on billboards and stadiums where they would be potentially focusing in on youth smokers to kind of prevent people from starting smoking. Now, these funds were used for a variety of purposes, but would support things like cigarette cessation programs, smoking cessation programs, as well as education, advertisement to discourage people from smoking. Now, the overall effects of this is that we can see from about 2000, basically 2 years after the Master Settlement Agreement, up to 2017, we're seeing a decrease of about 14% on adult smoking rates, and we're seeing a pretty dramatic reduction, about 73% reduction in the cigarette smoking by high school students, indicating that potentially this master settlement agreement has reduced smoking, the risk of smoking, because we have fewer people smoking, and so basically hopefully resulting in a healthier population. Now, the second industry example we're going to look at are going to be the opioid pain medications. And we've seen an increase in opioid addiction, opioid overdose, and opioid deaths that began in the 1990s. And so in this diagram, we're looking at the rates of opioid overdoses in purple for synthetic opioids, in this kind of bluish color for commonly prescribed opioids, and then for the darker blue for heroin. What we're seeing is that there is going to be an increase in opioid deaths in about 2010 associated with heroin, but then a very, very dramatic increase starting about 2013 in overdose deaths associated with synthetic opioids. And many of the drug companies are being blamed for aggressive marketing and selling of opioid drugs for pain reduction, but in essence, because of the high risk of addiction, we're seeing patients that have become addicted to these medications and basically kind of seeking either illicitly manufactured opioids such as fentanyl, or purchasing opioid drugs on the black market in some way. Now, similar to what we saw with the tobacco master settlement, we are beginning to see a number of agreements and settlements with the opioid industries. Upwards of about 3,000 state and local governments sued opioid makers and distributors in an effort to recoup the billions in taxpayer dollars that were being spent in dealing with the opioid epidemic, either dealing with the crisis of overdose and the increase on the healthcare expenditures, dealing with the addiction problem. And so examples of that we can see are in 2021, there was a $26 billion settlement with Johnson & Johnson and 3 pharmaceutical distributors for a payment over 18 years. In 2022, Purdue Pharma, a developer and manufacturer of one of these opioids reached a $6 billion settlement, which is currently still under review, to basically kind of use to provide funds for opioid treatment and prevention, but basically provides immunity for the family and the company from future opioid lawsuits by making this settlement, because the company is basically admitting no wrongdoing. So in the two examples we've looked at, we can see that both the tobacco industry and the opioid pain reliever industry are producing products which have a high risk of detrimental effects, of harmful effects associated with them. And because of that, they have been held accountable for billions of dollars, billions with a B, in however you want to think about it, basically funds that they're paying to offset the outcome or the effects of their products. Now, in a 2018 article within the New England Journal of Medicine, and basically a perspective, taking a look at the model of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, basically 20 years after that agreement was in place, and looking at this in relationship to other industries. And so the opioid industry is indicated in this even before we started seeing the large number of settlements associated with it. And so the idea being presented within this perspective within the New England Journal of Medicine is the idea that our state attorneys general are going to be protecting our public from consumer fraud, from deceptive financial disclosures, with the concept of basically a public nuisance claim against the manufacturers of these harmful products. And it becomes a public nuisance claim when the injury, the loss, or damage is being suffered by the public rather than individuals. And so in this case, tax dollars being addressed to these issues. And so we can see things on this, including the alcohol industry, the sugar-sweetened beverage and fast food industry, and then at the bottom of the diagram within this perspective is taking a look at the oil industry. And again, this was when it was just starting to come out with this understanding that these oil companies had data and scientific evidence on their own indicating the risks of global warming associated with the byproducts or the outcome or use of burning of these fossil fuels. Okay, so most recently, what we're seeing in the article, again, in The Guardian, in this case, in December of 2022, so just a short period of time ago, we're seeing that the island of Puerto Rico is suing the oil-producing companies under the RICO standards, the 1970 Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which was originally used to fight criminal enterprises by mafia, but has now been used more recently to examine, potential conspiracies associated with the companies, the production of their products, and the potential harmful effects associated with them. And now the basics for raising a RICO case against the oil companies is this idea that in 1989, many oil companies, as well as a variety of other oil-related industry companies, in 1989 created a global climate coalition as a nonprofit trade association, which was going to be influencing advertisements and promoting the interests of the fossil fuel industry. But in doing so, they were potentially giving information out, false information, that was at odds with their own internal data and evidence. Okay, so this leads into our ethical dilemma in science for this week. There's evidence that Exxon scientists overwhelmingly acknowledge that global warming is a real and human-caused effect. But their officials and official company public statements are promoting doubt on global warming and basically kind of emphasizing this uncertainty. That scientists aren't exactly sure what's going on, so because they're not exactly sure what's going on, we can't come to the conclusion that the effects of fossil fuel burning, the emissions associated with it, are contributing to global warming. In spite of that, a number of cities, counties, states, and other organizations have been filing lawsuits at a number of fossil fuel, or in this case, oil producing companies, indicating that they're using deceptive marketing, that they are misleading shareholders of the risk associated with their products, and that they should have some culpability or accountability associated with the damages to the climate that they're producing with these effects of oil production. And so basically, the ethical dilemma in science for this week is, should oil companies be accountable for the effects of oil use? And so two kind of prompts underneath this. Does a company have an obligation to inform the public of a risk of harmful effects from their products? And then within that question, does it depend on the probability of the risk from a harmful effect? Is it something that is likely to occur, or is it a rare thing that may or may not occur? What level of certainty of a possible risk is necessary before informing the public? We're convinced that this is an issue, so we're going to let you know, or there's just a risk, and we're not sure if it's going to happen or not. The other prompt: should a company be responsible for the harmful effects of their products? We see, a lot of recalls by the consumer protection industry, basically warning of, baby strollers and other things like that, even when used properly, have the risk of injuring an individual. Should these companies be responsible for the harmful effects of their products? And if so, should this extend to the oil industries? Does it matter if the company did not know of the possible risks at the time they were putting the product out, or if it kind of emerged once their product was available? Thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. Please see the description below for additional information and references. Thank you, and have a great week.